Let's take our Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 16 this afternoon. The book of Acts chapter 16. We've been on the first few verses of Acts chapter 16 for these few Bible studies, and we will continue today. From here we will start moving forward a little bit faster, but I thought it necessary for us to take some time and deal with some of the different lessons that can be learned from here. So we begin reading in Acts chapter 16, verse 1, which reads, "Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered them the decrees for to keep, that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem." And so we are on page 143 in our study book, and we are looking at the topic today of the good testimony of Timothy. Timothy had a good testimony. And we see that here in chapter 16, verse 2. Speaking of Timothy, it says, "which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium." And so what we are understanding from that is that Timothy, in his behavior, was someone that was respected, was someone that those around him, they had observed him and said, "This is a good man. This is a godly young man." And so he was well reported of. People would consider him to be a good person. And I'm thinking now of 1 Timothy chapter 3, which verse 7 is our memory verse for today. 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3 the requirements for a bishop as well as the requirements for a deacon. And if you look at verse 7 of the requirements of a bishop, it says, "Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." And so it is necessary, if you're going to be serving the Lord in a prominent position, that you should have a good testimony. That when people see you serving the Lord, that they don't have other things come into their mind concerning your character, concerning your spiritual life, concerning your way of living. And I want to ask the question today, if the Apostle Paul were to come to Carwash and start asking about you, or come to wherever community you live and start asking about you, if they would come and say, the Apostle Paul would come and say, "This Alfred's son, what do you know about him?" And go pass around the community. What do you know? What would the community people say? It would say, "Sam Duoba." Go through that community where Sam Duoba is. What would people say about him? And you can put your own name there. I'm just choosing two people just as an example. But if people would go through your own community and they would call your name, what would be the report? Would you be well reported of? Would people say, "I don't have any problem with that person. That person is straight. That person is a godly person. That person is doing the rightful thing"? Or would they say, "Well, actually, this person has this and this problem, or this person has some fault in this area," and is what is commonly reported? Because what was commonly reported of Timotheus was that he was a godly person, that he had a good report. And so that is what we see here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7. And then here in our notes it says, "We are again reminded that Christian workers are to be proven before taking a position of responsibility. And we read about that. We're already in 1 Timothy chapter 3 in verse 10. And let these also first be proved, then let them use the office of a deacon, being found blameless. One major mistake that many people make in ministry is they find someone who they want to do a job for them, and they hope that by giving them a position, that person will become faithful. Maybe you have someone in the church who is a very skilled musician, and so you want that person to participate in the church musically, but unfortunately, they can only come maybe every first Sunday, or once in a while they can come for service. And so you say, okay, well, I want them to be more active in the church, so let me make them the music director. Let me make them the music leader. And so what you do is you're hoping that since they will now have this position, now they will start to be faithful. But that almost never happens. The majority of the time, what happens is you take an unfaithful person, you give them a position, and they become an unfaithful person with a position. You have to prove someone first. Same thing goes with character. You don't say, oh, well, this person is living in sin, but we're going to make them a deacon, or we're going to make them a teacher in the church, and hopefully they will change. No. Let them first be proven. Test them. Make sure that there's... And you know what? Even if you do that, you will still have people that you thought were one way, and eventually you will find that they were a different way. No one is perfect. But if you already know that the person has problems, and then you put them in position in the church, what are you expecting? You expect them just to change because they now have a position? It won't work. Maybe for the first couple of months, okay, yeah, they'll be faithful, and they'll come soon, and they'll be active. But if that's not really in their heart, they will drop. And now you'll be dealing with that problem. And so we continue reading. Paul didn't say, Timothy hasn't been very faithful, and he seems to love many worldly things, but I hope that by giving him a ministry, he will straighten out. That was not the attitude Paul had. He did not say, okay, well, Timothy, really, people are really talking about you, that you are a bad person, you are someone who is not faithful, you are someone who has bad character, you are someone who is maybe involved in fornication or something else, and you know your whole testimony is spoiled all around, but you know what, just come and spend some time with me, and I'll give you a ministry. That's not how Paul did. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to restore people who are in sin. Galatians chapter 6 verse 1 is clear. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. It is one of our responsibilities as believers to restore sinning believers. But you don't restore them by giving them position. You restore them by coming beside them, by encouraging them, by teaching them, by motivating them, and by praying for them. So, it is not God's way to take unfaithful people or ungodly people or unspiritual people and give them a position of leadership within the church so that they will hopefully change. Let them change first. And let them change with no expectation. You know, some people, they will come to the church, and because they want a position, they will behave a certain way. They'll come faithful for some time. They'll be really active. Oh, pastor, that was a great message. Oh, yeah, they'll be... Because they have in their mind they want to be somebody in the church. But then if you wait for 3 months or 6 months or 1 year and you don't give them any position, soon they drop. Aha, okay, so now I know what was in your heart. It was not really that you had a desire to serve God. You really wanted to come and have position, and once you did not get your position that you expected you would get, now you drop. You see that? So that's why you have to observe people for some time. Because it protects the church. It protects the church. So, number 4, Paul had Timothy circumcised. We read that earlier already. In Acts chapter 16, verse 3. I'll turn back to that scripture. Him, speaking of Timothy, him would Paul have to go forth with him. So Paul had the intention, he said, I want Timothy to be with me. I want Timothy to be working in the ministry beside me. And because of that, he took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. So that was the decision that the Apostle Paul took concerning Timothy. Now, does that mean that today, in our setting and our environment, every male who is serving in the church must be circumcised? No. No. In fact, we read here, Paul didn't have Timothy circumcised out of necessity. And if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 18, it clearly says that we as believers should abide in the calling wherewith we have been called. If we came to Christ as a Jewish believer who was circumcised, well, remain that way. Of course, I guess you can't change it once you have been circumcised, but abide in that calling. But if you came to Christ as a Gentile who was uncircumcised, then remain that way as well. Because according to the Bible, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Those were Old Testament symbols of outward symbols of an inward faith. But that's not part of the New Testament anymore. Our outward symbol of our inward faith in the New Testament is baptism. And I'm not saying baptism is the same as circumcision. They are different, but they fulfill a similar role. In the Old Testament, and the reason why I'm clarifying that is because there are some people today that say you should baptize babies because in the Old Testament, the Jewish male children, they were circumcised on the 8th day. So they were just a newborn baby, they were circumcised. So some people say today that once you're born a child, you should baptize, because they think that baptism today is the same as circumcision then. It's not. It fulfills a similar role, but it's not the same thing. And so we don't baptize babies, we baptize believers. We believe in believers' baptism. However, they do fulfill a similar role. But because we have baptism today, we don't need circumcision because circumcision was the Old Testament way of identification with Jehovah God. And in the New Testament, our way of identification is through baptism. So the reason why was it was purely a matter of not offending the Jews to whom he was preaching. Since Timothy's mother was a Jew, and Timothy was therefore half Jewish, the Jews would have been offended if he wasn't circumcised. Paul didn't want anything to hinder the gospel. Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and I'll begin reading in verse 19. Verse 19, for though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I may gain more. What is he saying there? He's saying, although I don't have any responsibility to anybody. I am a free person. Yet I have made myself a servant to all. In other words, I have put myself under other people so that I will be able to win some. Verse 20, and unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I may gain them that are under the law. So you see, he said, when I am spending time with Jews, I will behave as a Jew. When I'm spending time around people who follow the Old Testament law, I myself will also follow the Old Testament law. He is not, and some might look at it and say, oh, but he is just being a hypocrite. He is behaving differently. No. He wasn't doing that. What he was doing was he didn't want his behavior to stand between him and someone else being able to receive the gospel. You know, if someone is trying to preach to you, okay, let me put it this way. Let's say you have a religion where you believe it is wrong for someone to wear a red t-shirt. So that's how you were trained since you were a baby. Anytime you see someone wearing a red t-shirt, you just think that person is so unbeliever. Now, someone comes to you to preach to you, and they are wearing a bright red t-shirt. Even if they have the right message, will you really pay them any mind? No. Is their doctrine wrong? No, their doctrine may be right. But because they are doing something that to you is offensive, you will not really listen to them. And so the Apostle Paul is saying, if I'm going to people who have this way of thinking, then I will not go and do that kind of thing in front of them and thereby make it so that they will not be willing to listen. I think, for example, of there's one church that supports us, and the pastor of that church believes that we still should follow the Old Testament dietary restriction. That is, we don't eat any unclean food. So for him, he does not believe it is right to eat pig. So, when I was there, every morning before we would go for service, he would take us to one restaurant for us to eat breakfast together. And when you go in America or Canada for breakfast in a restaurant, one of the main foods that they will serve you is bacon, is pig meat. It's a common meat that they will serve you. Now you have to order it, and they will say, okay, you will get this, and then which of the meat you want. So for me, usually, if I was going to a restaurant, I would order pig meat because I love pig meat. But now we're sitting down, and this pastor has made me aware of his belief concerning that. So you think it would be wise or even good for me to, in his presence, eat that pig meat and order pig meat? No. I wasn't being deceitful. If he would ask me and say, you get a problem with pig meat, I would say, no, I don't have a problem with it. But if he has already informed me of his belief, now I will sit in front of him and eat that same meat, what he does not believe is right. It would not be right. And so these are the things. So the Apostle Paul is looking at Timothy, and Timothy, someone who was from Jewish mother, the Jews, knowing that he has that Jewish background, they would be expecting that he should be circumcised because that was the way Jews behaved. And so to keep from Timothy offending the Jews, the Apostle Paul said, Timothy, even though circumcision is nothing, we need to circumcise you so that there will not be any problem in the future where people will, feel that you are not, that they will not be able to listen to you because of your circumcision. Let me continue reading. To them, verse 21, to them that are without the law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. So we continue reading. This same principle comes into play in evangelism among Hindus in Nepal. They believe strongly in the caste system. Castes cannot intermarry. So what that means is that there are different levels of civilization. Let's put it into our Liberian vernacular. You know, we have the civilized people and the uncivilized people, how people can think about each other, okay? So in India, they have different levels of civilization. I don't know how many, but they have the lowest people, then they have next and next and next and next, and to the highest people. And if you are from the low caste, you cannot just easily go and speak to someone who is from a higher caste. Or someone in one level cannot marry someone in a different level. You can only marry within your level. Now, I don't know how this is all decided. I've not really studied it well, but I do know some little thing about it. And so what David Cloud is saying here is, if you are going to an area to preach the gospel where all the people in that area were high up people, and your evangelism team was all so low caste people, you would not find much success there. Because you go there, the high up people, they would not listen to the people from down. Now, we can argue and we can say it is wrong for them to think that way. And it is wrong for them to think but that is how they think. So you cannot change the way they think. You have to go by how they think and try to preach the gospel anyway. So if you have someone who is, from a higher caste that you want to evangelize, you should send someone who is from the higher caste who can talk to them on the same level. And the same thing goes for middle caste and lower caste, right? And so these are some of the things. It's not compromise, and we're not saying that they are even right in the way that they do that, but that is their belief. And you cannot expect them to change their belief when they're not even saved. Of course, after they are saved, and you start preaching the gospel to them, and you say, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male or female, all that stuff, you will start to teach them, and hopefully they will grab a hold of the fact that there is no such thing as a higher person and a lower person in God's eye. But before they are saved, you think they will hear you when you talk about that? No. So you have to have wisdom in dealing with it. Our goal, and he's speaking from his own experience, is not to teach the Hindus the error of the caste system. Our goal is to preach the gospel to them so that they can be saved. After that, they can learn how to live in a godly way. Then, letter B. If Timothy had been fully Gentile, Paul would not have circumcised him, because the Jews did not expect Gentiles to be circumcised. We see this in the case of Titus. Since he did not have any Jewish blood, he was not circumcised. And we see that in Galatians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. So it's a matter of the situation. And this is one of the things that many believers struggle with. Because they want everything to be black and white. They want everything to be just very straightforward, very clear. And not everything is like that. In the Christian life, there are some things that in this situation it will be good to do, and in a different situation it will be bad to do. Just as I said regarding my interaction with that pastor. If I went with any other pastor for breakfast, I would order bacon. I would order pig meat. Why? Because I love it, and because I don't believe there's anything wrong with it, and because the pastor that I'm with also does not believe there's anything wrong with it. So in doing so, I would not be causing any offense. But it would be foolish for me to know that someone has a certain belief and then to intentionally go opposite of that belief instead of just submitting myself to them. And so we see here Timothy. We see that Timothy was well reported of, that Timothy was someone who was well respected, and I believe by his circumcision he became even more reported of, even better reported of and better respected, because the Jews, now they saw him to be someone who was like them, someone who was in line with their teaching, and so it was a wise decision. And that's one of the things, by the way, in missions. Coming up next month, we'll be having our mission conference again. And one of the things in missions is when you go to a people, you try your best to take on some of the traditions or take on some of the ways of interacting and ways of behaving as the people you were talking to. Hudson Taylor, when he went to China as a missionary, he dressed as a Chinese person. He took on the Chinese dress. It was very strange at that time. Most missionaries at that time, they would still wear their Western clothes and they would not dress as the people that they were ministering to. But Hudson Taylor said, the way people look at me, before I can even open my mouth, they don't want to hear from me because they see me as a stranger. So let me at least wear their own clothes, so when I talk to them, then at least I have chance, right? And so that's one of the things that is important in trying to reach people, is to try to identify yourself with them. Whether it be with their language, whether it be with their clothing, whether it be with their food that they eat, different traditions is necessary. It's important. Amen? Amen.